Who here has been having a good afternoon so far? Okay, good. Yeah, I did. It's just internet's being slow. Hold on. %. Hold on. Okay, how do I sign into NHow?
NH.
Yeah. Okay. Wi-Fi free, NH, Wi-Fi. Okay.
Press the tick.
Oh yes. Okay. Right. Press the tick. We got to reduce the tick times, right? Okay. Well, it's this Wi-Fi has faster data availability.
Maybe you gotta reduce the block size.
Yeah, no, the data compression on these PDFs still sucks. Can I just prove that I have a PDF without giving it to you?
Only if you credibly commit to it.
It's like.
Someone know how to present a PDF?
Yeah. Perfect. And I assume the laptop's still quicker?
Yes.
Alrighty.
You don't see it?
Plan. It's like relevance to sequencing. Actually, a bunch of reasons. I'm actually going to talk. It's like very relevance to sequencing. Well, but it's not all set yet. I see. I gotta wait for the cross L2 bridging. Okay. Great. So a topic I'll talk about today is faster slot times, and I think it's a topic that like really ends up like touching tangentially on pretty much every other theme that I think we care about here, right? Because it touches on how layer 2s work. It actually touches on cross layer 2 interoperability. It touches on what kinds of cross layer 2 interoperability even end up making sense, and basically, like pretty much every UX topic that like we've been talking about over the past 6 months, right? So first of all, let's talk a bit about confirmation times today, right? So this is just kind of the lay of the land in terms of where we realistically are right now, right? And okay, there we go. This is probably better. So back in the dark old days, before EIP 1559, average block time proof of work was 13. It was, like one of those fish distributions, and so sometimes it would be 3 seconds, sometimes it would be 3 minutes. And on top of that, basically you have this problem where, like, you send a transaction and you have to specify the fee that you're paying, and like if you set the fee too low, if you get unlucky with a gas spike, then potentially you have to wait a really long time, right? And so the amount of time that we had to wait is like pretty big. And at the time, we considered this to be an amazing improvement because at the time we all came from Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is even worse and stuff takes like over an hour, right? So since then, we've had EIP 1559. And 1559 has been a pretty big improvement, basically because you can reliably send transactions that pretty reliably get included within like the next 1 or 2 slots. You basically within the next slot, unless either the proposer is absent or the block is full, and blocks only ended up being full like something like roughly somewhere between 10 and 20% of the time. And then finally we had proof of stake. And one of the weird advantages of proof of stake that nobody talks about, but and it's like this very strange mathematical quirk, but it's still an advantage. Basically, even though the average block time is the same, the amount of time that you need to wait before on average, when you send a transaction gets cut by half. And this is basically because slots are fixed, and if you have a fixed slot time, then on average, when you send a transaction, you're halfway through a slot, right? And it also has this other interesting benefit, which is that because the slot times are fixed, the activity within a block is less spiky. The percentage of blocks that are full goes way down, and so you're basically almost the only chance where you don't get included in the next slot is when there's something wrong with the proposer. And so you have somewhere between 6 to 18 seconds, and then you have finality, which takes somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes, right? Now, 6 to 18 seconds is already pretty good, right? And by the standards of someone traumatized by pre-EIP 1559 transaction times, and in turn also traumatized by using waiting for 1 hour on the Bitcoin blockchain before that, and also continue to be traumatized to this day by credit card waiting periods, which are actually also basically about as long as 6 to 18 seconds. Then this kind of feels fine, right? But at the same time, I think there is a lot of desire for users to experience confirmations that come even faster than this. And at the same time, with proof of stake, there's also this extra concept of finality, right? So you have confirmations, and then you also have finality. But in practice, I have not seen any service in years that actually waits for finality, right? Most of the time, people still just count confirmations. And so I think I think it is kind of fair to sort of conclude that the great experiment in finality, in a kind of hybrid finality, at least as we've done it so far, has been a failure. But that also doesn't mean that that better versions of it can't work, right? And that's one of the things that I'll get into. And then this is on L1, right? On L2, you have pre-confirmations, and pre-confirmations often come in less than 1 second. And then you have settlement to L1, and settlement to L1, depending on the L2, it takes somewhere between minutes and hours, right? So this is kind of the lay of the land in terms of how long you have to wait right now, right? Now, users want shorter confirmation times, right? And a lot of the complexity that we're talking about basically has to do with solving for the problem of how to give users shorter confirmation times while at the same time preserving certain other properties that we care about. Often some kind of decentralization, often some other properties. So realistically, there's basically 3 kinds of strategies that I think we've seen in terms of how to get confirmation times that are shorter than 12 seconds so far. One of them is independent layer 2 pre-confirmations, right? So, who here has used a layer 2? Who here has used a layer 2 that has confirmed a transaction for them pretty much instantly? So, you could do this, right? Now, who here has has had coins on one of those layer 2s and then needed to move those coins to another one of those layer 2s and discovered that it's not instant? Okay. Now, then we have L1 organized pre-confirmations, aka base confirmations. Who here has invented base pre-confirmations? You're supposed to raise your hand. Okay. So this is basically the second category of solution, right? And the third category of solution is L1 slots being natively faster in some sense, right? And so I basically see kind of, the second and the third as kind of trying to solve for the same problem, right? But solving for the problem in a way that you can kind of describe as basically being different implementation details, right? But the goal is to basically have some kind of shared L1 capability for delivering faster confirmation times. So there's 2 questions in this, right? One of the questions is why, and the other question is how. And let's start off talking about the how, right? So this is an Ethereum slot structure. Raise your hand if you've seen this diagram before. You haven't because I made it in draw.io less than 24 hours ago. But you've probably seen similar diagrams before. So this basically is Ethereum slots, right? So you have a block, And then 4 seconds later, you have attestations. And with attestations, you have lots and lots of attestations. 4 seconds after that, those attestations get aggregated. And then after another 4 seconds, the aggregates make it into the next block, right? And each of those subslots is 4 seconds long, and 4 seconds is kind of our delta parameter. So it's the, basically we make an assumption that the network latency is, or the time between an honest actor sending a message and any other honest actor receiving the message is 4 seconds, or at most. So basically, you have this pattern, right? So you have blocks, attestations, aggregations, blocks, and the slot time is 12 seconds. The average wait is half a slot, which is 6 seconds. And then in an unhappy case, so in the case where one proposer just like goes offline or does something wrong or decides to censor you, it goes up to 18 seconds, right? So this is kind of what we're working with today, right? And so the question is basically like, how do we improve on this, right? So one nuance that I want to kind of zero in on is basically the difference between confirmations and finality, right? And here, like, I think, you know, I'm definitely contradicting myself as of 2 years ago a little bit, right? Basically, yeah, you know, this is sort of an argument against the ideal of single slot finality as was described originally. And this is basically saying that, like, well, actually, it's fundamentally harder to provide finality than it is to provide like medium strength confirmation. And it's actually fundamentally harder by so much that there's just value in providing the medium strength confirmation before you provide finality, right? So finality inherently requires something like 4 delta, potentially 6 delta of latency, right? Basically because you know, you have a 2-round BFT protocol, potentially 3-round BFT protocol to support inactivity leaks. And then also when you're talking about finality, in order to have economic security, you need to have like this like large portion of the entire Ethereum validator set. You can't just rely on a randomly selected committee. And so you have to do this kind of like 2-round aggregation process, right? Now, potentially if we go up to like 100 million validators, that becomes 3 rounds. But no, that's a discussion for another day. We'll you know, let George figure out how to do perfect aggregation first. So aggregation requires 2 delta, you need 2 rounds, so finality requires a lot of latency. Confirmation only requires delta, right? So you have no need for aggregation, you can do it with fewer nodes, and it only requires 1 round. So basically, medium strength assurance will be faster than finality, and so one of the openings that we have is basically to like actually find good ways to add this kind of medium strength assurance onto Ethereum, right? So what is this basically advocating? Well, it's advocating a slot and epoch architecture, which is what we have today. But you know, the argument basically is that like there's actually lots of different ways to do a slot and epoch architecture. And like honestly, the way that we started off is like it has a lot of flaws, right? And we know about what those flaws are, right? Basically, you know, the slot by slot structure, the LMD ghost, and the epoch by epoch structure, you know, meaning the finality, are kind of tightly interwoven with each other in a way that makes it harder to have sane security proofs, and there's like a bunch of difficulties. So there's better ways to do it. And on top of that, like, there's value in actually making finality happen faster, right? So today, finality is 12 to 18 minutes, and so nobody really cares about waiting for finality. If instead, confirmation was 2 seconds, which is like on the slow end of you know, like a Web 2 activity, and finality is let's say 12 to 16 seconds, which is on the slower end of you know, credit card payments, then like people might actually care about finality more, right? So this is kind of one of the paths that I think is available to us, right? So one of the discussions, I think, is to kind of like compare and contrast, you know, like this kind of basically finality as, or confirmations as this kind of Ethereum level functionality, or like that's provided by, you know, attesters and kind of the entire protocol, versus this approach of like basically these pre-confirmations being a proposer provided convenience. And like, this isn't just an either or, right? Like you can combine both, right? Like you can have a system where you have like Ethereum provide a pre-confirmation every 2 seconds as like an in-protocol functionality, and then proposers go and provide their own pre-confirmations every, you know, like 42 milliseconds, right? You can do that if you want. So I think the challenge with like relying on proposer preconfs is basically, one is that it does, I think, to some extent rely on like fat proposers of some kind, or either fat proposers or proposers having to make an active choice of like which fat actor they delegate to, right? Like one of the two. And I think either of those ideas are like an idea that does not yet have 100% consensus, right? Like this is basically one of my observations of Ethereum's EIP process is basically that like a lot of the time what happens is you have like the research cool kids, and the research cool kids basically have this kind of like, like happy cycle where they all convince themselves like, hey, this is an idea, this idea is really cool, okay, yeah, we've discussed this internally for 6 months and we've posted about it on ETH Research, and we've, like vibed about it at 2 offsites already, and so we have consensus. And then it turns out that like it gets into the ACD part of the pipeline, and then like, oh my god, like Peter Szilagyi completely hates it, right? So basically, like we do have this kind of like situation where like a lot of the time an idea does sort of look unopposed until it actually comes time to implement it, and then it like switches from far mode to near mode, and then people realize like, oh my god, wait, this isn't just somebody's science fiction novel, this is actually happening, and like I don't feel good about this, right? And like one of my worries is that like basically the entire category of all of these fat proposer ideas is like in that stage, and like that doesn't mean that I'm strictly against fat proposers, right? It basically means that like it might even be the right choice, but it does mean that like today in 2024, I think it's like a good argument against staking the future of Ethereum and Ethereum's usability on fat proposer ideas. So that's one of those challenges. The second challenge is basically, if a proposer does not participate, you're back to 12 seconds for that slot, right? So basically, if you imagine a system where, like, let's say, we're going to run like a game on top of this, right? And let's say have a game, and like, who here has played games before? Who here has played, those kinds of games where, like, you really care about whether or not your latency is like 145 milliseconds or 322 milliseconds, and then suddenly something happens, and then your latency for like a little bit jumps up to 12 seconds, and then after those 12 seconds, things come back to normal, but then you realize that like, oh my god, all the important stuff happened, and your character is dead, and you're sitting in front of like the release spirit icon. Okay. So basically, there are applications, like you don't want to have these kind of fat tails, right? And then the other challenge, of course, is like censorship, right? Like basically, inclusion lists are only able to operate at the Ethereum native slot level, and so, you don't, like, there are applications where like even being able to censor someone for 12 seconds, such as if you're in some kind of duel with them in a video game, like you don't want to be able to censor all their moves for 12 seconds, that, like are just like something you really want to avoid. So, and then also I think there's another argument, which is basically that proposer preconfs are kind of bounded by, economic value at stake, and potentially you could have like some MEV shitstorm, some $180 million monkey sale, just like something that goes above whatever the limit is, right? So this is like how I see some of the challenges. I mean, I know that there are counter arguments, and I know Justin is there, and I know he's gonna probably have like as many presentations this week as I will, where I'm sure he's gonna give excellent counter arguments, right? But basically, I think this is, like I think it's good to know sort of both the ups and downs of like all three of these approaches, right? Now, independent L2 preconfirmations. Independent L2 preconfs are basically the status quo, right? And I think the challenge that I see with independent L2 preconfs are, one is like every L2 needs to do in 90% of the work of like being an L1. And like realistically, we are putting a lot of work on L2 teams, and like it is a lot of work where like, it's not just a lot of work. The other kind of concern I have is like we're putting this kind of like a lot of load on these teams to sort of, like do things for kind of, the greater good of the ecosystem's values. And like that's one of those levers that you can only push so hard, right? Like if you push that lever too hard, then like at some point, people are just going to snap, and people are going to, like basically, just like start calling you ideological and crazy, and then just like basically, like rebel against, the entire enterprise of trying to have any values at all, right? And this is the story of like at least half of modern politics. So basically the challenge is like there's two of these kind of like big kind of idealistic things that I think we're pushing on L2s at the moment, where one of them is decentralized sequencing, and the other is like actually having proof systems, right? And like the reason why I call them idealistic things is like we agree that they're valuable long term, and long term there's like even very good pragmatic cases for them, right? Like you don't want like your money to just like if you have an L2 that gets run by like SBF type people, like you want to have a proof system there, right? So the basically, and then the other one is, and then for decentralized sequencing, it's like from a user point of view, like you don't even notice if you have a centralized or a decentralized sequencer, right? And like if you look at what's happening in practice, then like the path to getting to decentralized sequencing and to having actual proof systems is like getting like I think slower than a lot of people expected, right? And so I think there is like a valid case for basically saying like, okay, well, maybe it actually makes sense for this whole decentralized sequencing thing to just kind of be an Ethereum-wide functionality, and like basically actually allow L2s to focus on making a higher quality effort at a smaller subset of the problem, right? Which includes having a proof system. It includes interoperability. It includes other things, right? But like this idea that like basically L2s need to do like 90% of the work that they would have to do if they were L1s, right? Basically, like I think this is one of those sort of challenges of the status quo that we're kind of hitting against, right? And Ethereum does get criticized for like basically L2s like essentially being servers all the time, right? And we need to have like pragmatic ways of getting past that. So that, and then I think one other challenge that I did not talk about here is basically interoperability issues, right? So there's value in not just transactions within one L2 or within one of these L2 sub-ecosystems being fast, but also transactions between any part of the Ethereum verse and any other part of the Ethereum verse being fast, right? And like it would be nice if we could get to a world where jumping from one L2 to another L2 is something that can actually happen in a couple of seconds, right? So, and then the other one, of course, is like users get a very heterogeneous and confusing security model, right? Because it's like, okay, I sent a transaction. I have a pre-confirmation. Or, okay, so I sent a transaction on Optimism, and this transaction is doing a 7683 thing. And then, okay, someone else gave me coins on Polygon, and they're a liquidity filler. And then I used their coins to immediately send another transaction. So, okay, so now we've got some pre-confirmation on the Optimism side, pre-confirmation on the Polygon side. And like, what the heck do those even mean? Okay, I have to go and like look up, like Optimism and Polygon and L2 beat, and like basically figure out like, are their pre-confirmation mechanisms legit, or are they basically scams? So it's like, okay, like 2 queries to L2 beat later, and then, like basically this whole thing just gets confusing, right? So the more, like basically these are all benefits that, or these are all problems that do go away if there is like some kind of standardized Ethereum-wide like faster confirmation facility of some kind, right? So those, I think, are some of the whys, right? Basically, the whys are that, users do want faster confirmation times, right? But at the same time, there's like basically all these disadvantages to a lot of these existing mechanisms for doing it. And so one of the questions is like basically what makes sense for layer 2 for rollups to do, right? And I think today we basically have like roughly 3 kinds, right? So we have based rollups. Raise your hand if you've sent a transaction on a based rollup. They exist now. Few node chain backed by many node Ethereum security. Raise your hand if you've sent a transaction on one of those. Are you sure it's one of those? Are you sure it's not just a server promising to be one of those? Okay. And server with scaffolding, right? And okay. So I think the thing with servers with scaffolding, right, is like, I mean, obviously today they're like a transition stage for rollups that are like kind of embarrassed and want to move into category 2 eventually. But I think like there is also valid room for servers with scaffolding that are just like proudly servers with scaffolding, right? Like there's a lot of applications where, like basically if you just think of any application that's on a server today, that application will probably be like at least epsilon better if it commits Merkle roots to Ethereum and it pushes snarks to Ethereum, and so you have assurance that the rules are being followed, right? Like, so I think there's like basically all kinds of applications that benefit from just having like even a little bit of assurance that comes from having their internal database basically put inside of a proof system and with hashes that get published to chain in real time. Like that's just like a valuable thing, right? You get security gains, you get interoperability gains, you get all kinds of gains. So these are the 3 types of rollups today, right? And right now, based rollups are kind of at this disadvantage because 12-second swap times are still a little bit too long for a lot of things, right? And so the question is like, you know, if L1 gets like some kind of native speed up, then whether that comes from, you know, Ethereum-wide native reconfirmations, whether that comes from like some kind of faster slots, then like the demand for category 2 might shrink. It might disappear. It might shrink by like 30%. It might like I have no idea, right? But like realistically, it will shrink, right? And so this I think is like one of those conclusions that is worth thinking about. I mean, I do think that it's a conclusion that like a lot of rollup teams are already prepared for, right? Because what we have today is like a lot of rollup teams basically already kind of have you know, the rollup offering and the Validium offering, and like I actually think that's a good strategy, right? And I expect that like there's a good chance that what we're going to see in 5 years is like a lot of L2s will have you know, the based offering and like the proud server offering. And right, and you know, you might actually see decentralized you know, like sequencers in some categories as well, right? So this is like basically you know, like the trade-off landscape between these 3 does you know, end up shifting quite a bit, right? And like it can shift in both directions, right? Basically, like one of the ideas that I advocated for about a year ago, I think, is basically saying like, okay, if L2s have to do this kind of like their own pre-confirmation scheme, then maybe it actually makes sense for L1 slots to just like go all the way up to 64 seconds, right? And if L1 slots go all the way up to 64 seconds, then like doing single slot finality with like 20 million validators becomes trivial. We can you know, find clever ways to reduce the requirements of the deposit requirements to 1 ETH. We can do like Stark to recursive whatever signatures, and it doesn't matter if recursive Starking takes 5 seconds. If recursive Starking takes 15 seconds, then like fine, screw it, we'll do 128-second slots, and like it doesn't matter too much because L2s have pre-confirmations, right? Like this is like one of the ideas that I've definitely expressed at some point. This is basically saying going the other direction, right? And basically saying like L1 takes on more responsibility for being fast. I think. I mean, I think there is value in exploring these different futures, right? Basically, like I think one of the concerns that we have right now is like, there definitely is an aspect in which Ethereum is kind of in this awkward middle, right? Where a lot of the time it pays the costs, or it pays like a medium level of cost from providing a functionality at a medium level of quality. But then it turns out that like that medium level of quality is just not even useful. And so all the L2s end up like implementing their own logic to just like push it up to the higher level of quality anyway, right? And like when that happens, then like if we identify those situations, then there's basically 2 actions that make sense, right? It's like either you, you know, reduce the L1 functionality to the 0 level of quality and then just let L2s do it, or you actually push L1 up to the higher level of quality and then it just like becomes native, right? Like a lot of the time, if you look at it from like a holistic ecosystem perspective, that like there are basically unclaimed simplification gains that can really be made here, right? So that's like basically, you know, like how I see the landscape of like possibilities here. So, like basically, you know, to summarize, you know, I think the thing that I like the core framework here is basically this, right? Like basically, there's 3 strategies. Users want confirmations to be faster. There's a couple of different ways to get it, and I think it's valuable to just like think really explicitly about the question of like, how do we actually provide this functionality? Like, which of these, which kind of approach is the least bad, and like which kind of approach is the best, and basically try to like think through like what set of infrastructure actually makes sense in order to do one of these strategies well. So thank you.
We have time for a few questions. Raise of hands.
We have another mic back here too to pass around.
Perfect,
so.
yeah. You want to lead that?
Yeah, sure. Cool. I have a question actually to start off with, and then keep your hands raised so we can move to the next person. You've sort of articulated, Vitalik, sort of how having L1 slots be faster, or just having a faster L1 can be useful for L2s. The question's in 2 parts. Like one, on what kind of timeline realistically do we think, even if we came up with the whole plan today, right, that this could actually happen on the L1? And then maybe comment then on, could you, if another protocol provided the same functionality for L2s that were not the L1 itself, but say run by L1 validators through EigenLayer, or simply another protocol that provides exactly the same functionality that the L1 would provide, to what extent could that achieve the same benefits for L2s or not?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, I think realistically, yeah. I mean, the differences between something being provided at L2 and something being provided at L1, right? So at L2, one benefit is obviously that if things go wrong, then like there's like this degree of kind of like indirection, like you kind of get this quarantining effect, right? Where if that mechanism screws up, then at least the L1 is still safe, right? And that's definitely a really valuable thing. The downsides, I think, are basically that, one is just like lower security, right? Like I think anything that's not Ethereum, doesn't have the ability to, control the Ethereum fork choice, for example, right? So I guess lower theoretical maximum security would be one way of putting it. I mean, there's also obviously, economic issues of like basically, like if any one of these functionalities is like a natural monopoly, then it's basically saying that like if one of those functionalities is a natural monopoly and like the Ethereum ecosystem goes out and says like go and use this, then that's like basically a lot of money that's like being handed to one particular group, right? So that's also a downside. Obviously that's a downside in any of these, in a lot of these cases, right? So like, for example, that's also an argument, that argument is also an argument for like Ethereum doing enshrined oracles, for example, right? But, raise your hand here if you've ever advocated for Ethereum having enshrined oracles. Okay, yeah, but the weakness obviously is like the quarantining effect, right? It's like basically, an oracle is just like inherently this real world thing, and like if ever like the value of some number becomes a political controversy, then like Ethereum depends on it, right? So I think it's like basically that same kind of trade-off at some point.
How fast is too fast? Like, are we making a trade-off here at the cost of, say, incentivizing more solo stakers and solo validators in this system? And if so, is this a trade-off that we're sort of willing to make for the sake of giving faster block times?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, so I expect there's like a limited extent to which it's not a trade-off. Basically, the limited extent is like, if we keep delta at 4 seconds and we have like 4-second length pre-confirmations, right? Then like you can design a protocol where like as long as your latency is at the 4-second level, then you're fine, right? If we want to push lower than that, then like that definitely does put more load on validators. There are, to be fast, right? Now, there are tricks that we can use to try to compensate for this, right? Like one popular trick that I think keeps sort of subliminally being discussed in a lot of engineering circles is like the idea of delayed state roots, right? So like basically, you only actually need to execute the transactions in block n during block n+1, right? And like if you do that kind of pipelining, then there is an argument that potentially allows you to like reduce the slot time by even more without actually like increasing requirements on solo stakers. But then if you want to go even further than that, then like there does come a point at which you've basically eaten all the free lunches, or you've eaten all the lunches where like you pay for the lunch in costs other than centralization risk, and at that point like you do have to make a judgment of like basically like let's make some empirical measurements of like actually existing validators in actually existing contexts, including like all across the world, and like let's see like how validators in like Asia and Latin America and like Africa would be handling this that kind of thing. And like there definitely would come a point where if you push it too low, then we start unacceptably like sacrificing on things. So there definitely does come a balance at some point. But I do think that like actually sitting down and do the work of like making those measurements explicitly is just a super valuable exercise for the ecosystem to do.
Cool. Thanks for the talk. I just want to ask sort of a meta question. I think some of what you talked about was in this domain, which is I feel like this part of the Ethereum roadmap has been exploding with heterogeneity and like a lot of different ideas and maybe even complexity, like the sequencing part of the Ethereum roadmap. How, as a community, ought we to try to, I guess, navigate this complexity? Maybe also in light of some of the fact that like private, and these can easily get captured by those going off and saying, let's implement it this way and add even more complexity somehow. Like, what is any suggestions on how we ought to approach this?
I think there's one part of this that we've already been through before and one part of this that we have not been through before. So the part of this that we have been through before is basically the Ethereum sharding discussions, right? Like if you remember Ethereum sharding discussions back in like 2016 to 2020, there was like this like zoo of like super crazy complicated proposals. Like who here remembers hypercubes? Okay, then you have hypercubes. Then you have like hub and spoke designs. You have like various designs for asynchronous messaging. You had designs for execution environments. There was like this like big zoo of just like different creative solutions. And then at some point there was just this kind of like natural process by which the mechanisms just kind of kept on being iterated on and then being simplified and then eventually converged. And like this is the minimal viable thing that we can actually convince people to implement, and then it got implemented, right? So I think like that does present a path by which these kinds of ideas can move forward. I mean, account abstraction, I think, is another one of those examples where like I think there are multiple groups that have been pushing for multiple proposals, and we actually did manage to like basically work hard and like actually find a path that like all of the major camps consider to be major progress toward their desired end state. So like that's another template, right? But those are both, I think, on the kind of lower stake side. I mean, the sharding stuff was basically back before there were any of these other interests. The account abstraction stuff probably a little bit less so. I mean, I'm sure some of you have seen the threads on Ethereum magicians of like people accusing each other of being co-opted in those discussions. So like it's it's definitely non-zero of that. But in this case, like it's definitely pretty like more significant than before. I think. I mean, realistically, in terms of like solutions to that, right? I mean, one part of it is just like following these templates that are like the closest that we've come before to actually succeeding in making these kinds of agreements. And I think another part of the answer is just like basically increasing the level of like high quality research talent that we have that is kind of both diverse and that is like not connected to at least some kind of profit interest, at least at least within that direct space. So I think the more we can kind of passively move on that, the more we get something that hopefully looks like what happened with account abstraction instead of looking like some kind of shit show that's 10 times worse than that.
I'm going to jump in. So we're going to have Vitalik back on in about 25 minutes, along with Justin and some other folks, to do a panel. So I'm going to save the rest of the questions for that. And yeah, we'll just move on to the next presentation for now. Thank you, Vitalik.